One of the most difficult of all philosophical questions is the following: what came first, the chicken or the egg? Now, of course, Professor Darwin has given us an answer to the question, or more accurately, rendered the question unintelligible. But whether or not the question still stands, its form leaves us something to ponder. Indeed, the chicken and egg question remains intriguing not so much in our inability to solve it, but rather in its ability to point to the fact that when it comes to things like chickens and eggs, both seem to cause each other. Eggs come from chickens, come from eggs, come from chickens, and so on. In a case like this, determining which came first is indeed difficult, if not an impossible task. In our reading for today, William Frankena raises a sort of chicken and egg dilemma. His conundrum, of course, has less to do with Kentucky's object of frying and the breakfast companion of bacon, and more to do with, well, ethics. Namely, Frankena raises the following question: which comes first, good virtues or good actions? Before we begin to see how Frankena answers this question, however, we must first see how he arrived at it in the first place. Let's begin. The piece of philosophy that we read by Frankena for today is a critique of the virtue-based ethics, of the ethics of the sort that is adhered to by philosophers such as Aristotle and Susan Wolff. Like all good critiques, then, Frankena starts with a summary of his opponent. In order to understand virtue ethics, Frankena begins, we must first understand virtues. You can't play around at golf without learning to hold a golf club. You certainly can't study virtue-based ethics without having any idea what virtues are. First, then, virtues refer to a good character trait or a good disposition. When we say that someone has the virtue of courageousness, for instance, it means that the person is disposed to doing courageous things and that this disposition is good. Second, virtues are acquired, not innate. We are not born truthful or liars or temperate, but learn to be so. And third, virtues, like any other character traits or dispositions, refer to ways of being rather than to things that are done. For instance, we say that it is virtuous to be courageous, not a virtue to do courageous things. So then, Frankena continues, now that we know something about virtues, we can begin to understand virtue-based ethics. Namely, virtue-based ethics will place these good character traits and dispositions that we call virtues at the center of ethics. In doing so, virtues become the measure of goodness. Therefore, in order to be good, our task first and foremost for the virtue ethicist must involve acquiring good dispositions and character traits. Furthermore, the mark of a good life for the virtue-based ethicist will not lie in the things a person does, but rather in the way a person is. With this, Frankena ends his summary of virtue-based ethics. I don't know about you, but I think the summary does a pretty good job of capturing the way philosophers like Aristotle and Wolff view the good life. Having thus outlined his opponent, Frankena begins setting him up for the knockout punch. This setup, like all setups, begins with a seemingly innocent observation. Namely, Frankena notes that virtues, insofar as they are good dispositions, are inextricably tied to certain actions. When we say, for instance, that someone has the virtue of being courageous, we are saying that they have a disposition to do courageous acts. When we say someone has the virtue of being compassionate, we are saying that they have the disposition to do compassionate acts. Frankena's point, in short, is that it is impossible to have a certain virtue, to be a certain way, without doing the action towards which that virtue disposes us. By way of parallel, think about the impossibility of a person who claims to have a disposition to eating chocolate cake, but has never eaten and will never actually eat a piece of chocolate cake. The claim is simply absurd. It is equally absurd, or so Frankena's arguments goes, to divorce virtues from the actions to which they dispose us. Frankena, having thus shown the inextricable link between virtues and actions, he is ready for the second stage of setting up virtue-based ethics for his knockout punch. The second stage involves another seemingly innocent observation. Namely, Frankena notes that virtues are not merely dispositions, but good dispositions. Various Nazis may have had a disposition to killing Jews, a Jew-killing character trait, but we would have hardly called this character trait, this disposition, a virtue. What we need to do then, observes Frankena, is figure out what makes a virtue good, what separates, in other words, virtues from other dispositions. This observation observed, Frankena is ready to deal virtue-based ethics a knockout blow. Indeed, all he has to do is make the following proposal. The only way to figure out which dispositions are good is by considering the actions towards which they are inextricably linked. For example, take the contrasting dispositions of being truthful and being a liar. How do we know which is the virtue, which is the good disposition? Well, we look at the actions to which they dispose us. Clearly, telling the truth is good and lying is bad. Therefore, being truthful is a virtue, and being a liar is a vice. If this is true, however, if it is true that virtues are good in terms of the actions to which they dispose us, then actions become the measure of goodness. This is something the virtue ethicist cannot accept, for, as we have seen, the virtue-based ethicist wants to make virtues the measure of goodness. If we accept Frankena's argument, it thus does seem to be an extremely valid critique of virtue-based ethics, as advocated by Aristotle and Wolff. But if Frankena is correct, then what should be done with the virtues? Should we stop worrying about them altogether, as goodness is ultimately measured by the actions to which virtues dispose us? Not at all. Indeed, says Frankena, while virtues may not be good in themselves, they are still good, just in reference to the right actions to which they dispose us. To put it differently, it is good to cultivate virtues in that they encourage us to do the right thing when push comes to shove. Think about the goodness of virtues for Frankena like this. Say Betty and Bessie have a choice. They must choose between facing an extremely boring day of work or lying to their boss and telling him they have the swine flu. Let's just assume in this case that despite the drudgery awaiting them, it is clearly right for Betty and Bessie to be truthful and show up to work. Now, let's further suppose that Betty has cultivated a truthful disposition, while Bessie, on the other hand, has been lying like a proche since she was 4 years old. Frankena's question is this: who is more likely to do the right thing and go to work? Clearly Betty is. She has a disposition to being truthful, and so it will be easier for her to overcome the temptation to skip work. Situations like this, then, are the reason virtues are still important to Frankena. Indeed, while virtues are certainly not the measure of goodness, as folks like Aristotle suppose, they do still come in handy in helping out get the right thing done. At this point, we may ask Frankena, okay, so which virtue should we be cultivating? What character traits, in other words, will best dispose us to right action? Well, says Frankena, first we must see that there are really just two basic types of right actions: benevolence, or actions of benevolence or love, and actions of justice or equality. Every right action falls under one of these two categories. It's right to keep promises and refrain from killing people because doing so shows love for our neighbor. It's wrong to discriminate because doing so is unjust, and so on. Therefore, we need only really worry about cultivating the virtues that will dispose us to performing benevolent and just actions, the virtues of being benevolent and just. As all good actions are either benevolent and just, or just, if we cultivate the virtues of being benevolent and just, we will be disposed to performing all good actions. With this, Frankena has reached the end of his argument. It's worth noting that the ethical model he proposes in practice ends up looking extremely similar to the models proposed by both Wolff and Aristotle. Indeed, all three agree that living the good life involves both doing good things and cultivating a virtuous character. However, while Frankena's ethics may look similar to Aristotle's and Wolff's in practice, in theory they are, as we have seen, incredibly different. Indeed, for the virtue ethicist, actions are good only because they cultivate and come out of a good character. For Frankena, characters are only good insofar as they dispose us to doing certain good actions. To put it differently, virtue ethicists like Aristotle and Wolff believe character to be the measure of goodness, while Frankena believes actions to be the measure of goodness. Frankena's dispute with virtue ethicists thus comes down to a dilemma much like the one posed by chickens and eggs. Indeed, just as an egg produces a chicken produces an egg, so too a good character produces good actions produces a good character. In other words, just as chickens and eggs seem to be the cause of each other, so too good actions and good characters seem to be the cause of each other. The dilemma is figuring out which comes first, which, in other words, is the basis for the other's goodness. Perhaps Frankena succeeded in convincing you that it is actions that are the measure of goodness, that the goodness of a person's character is based on that person's actions. Perhaps, however, you still side with the virtue ethicists. Perhaps you still believe character to be the measure of goodness, still believe that the goodness of actions are based in the person's character. Or perhaps you simply can't decide. Perhaps, in other words, all Frankena has succeeded in doing is showing you that, like determining whether the chicken or egg came first, it is very difficult to answer whether our character or our actions are the measure of goodness. Recognizing this difficulty in itself is important as, unlike the chicken and egg question, Darwin can't simply make this dilemma go away.